Hey everybody, Yankee here. You know, one thing that's true today is that it is getting very expensive to survive. Corporations and companies that produce the products we consume are raking us over the coals with pricing. You know, everything is getting more expensive. It's like they're trying to see how far they can push us before we fight back. And no, you can't say it's because of inflation, because if it was because of inflation, their profit margins would stay pretty much consistent, at least percentage-wise, but they aren't. Their profits are going through the roof. They're skyrocketing. CEO pays are going up like crazy, while we suffer with high prices just because they can. And you know, one of the companies, one of the manufacturing industries that rakes us over the coals is the gun industry. They've raised gun prices so high that people can barely afford them anymore. If you were alive back in the 70s, guns were so much cheaper. Everyone could afford a gun back then. Now they're super expensive because, like I said, manufacturers raking us over the coals. You know, that sounds true, but is it really true? Are guns more expensive nowadays than they used to be? Some things are undeniably more expensive than they used to be. Houses, cars, groceries, things like that. In fact, lots of things. But are gun manufacturers joining in on this? Are they raking us as consumers over the coals? And the way we have to see that is we have to go back and do all the numbers. We have to see, what did a gun cost back in the day? How much did people earn? What would that gun cost today with inflation? What would it cost in regards of being compared to what people actually earn? We have to look at all the numbers. You know, you just can't listen to someone go, well, back in my day, I bought a Colt Python for, $300, and then I got a pack of smokes for a nickel. You know, that doesn't really hold any water when it comes to seeing if they're more expensive today or not, because that same guy probably spent $25,000 to buy a new split-level home and a car. So like I said, you have to have perspective and you have to have scale here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back today to 1970. I'm getting in the Wayback Machine with Mr. Peabody. I'm not actually doing that. I don't want to be raped by a dog, and I have a feeling that Sherman got raped quite a few times in that scenario. So I'm not really doing that, but I'm going to go back to 1970, digging through information, finding MSRPs on guns from then. We're going to look at what people made on average back then as a salary, and we're going to compare it to today's costs. And we're also going to compare the cost of guns then to what they would be now if they went up as much as some other things that actually have increased in price comparative to the average salary. So like I said, we're going to go back to 1970. We're going to look at 3 popular gun models. We're going to look at a Colt Python. We're going to look at a Smith & Wesson J-frame, probably like a Model 36. And we're going to look at a Ruger Blackhawk. Now, the reason we're going back to 1970 is because that makes math easy for me. Because back in 1970, the average household income was around $6,000. In 2024, it's around $60,000. So I just got to multiply things by 10. So that's really easy math. So let's look at these 3 guns: the Colt Python, the Smith & Wesson Snubby, the 36, and the Ruger Blackhawk. Back in 1970, when the average salary was $6,000, the Colt Python MSRP was $184. The Smith & Wesson Snubby MSRP was $95. And the Blackhawk from Ruger, that MSRP was $90. Now, if we take these MSRPs and adjust them from 1970 to 2024, just by the rate of inflation, that would make a Colt Python cost $1,714. It would make the Smith & Wesson cost $885, and it would make the Ruger Blackhawk cost $838. That is quite a big jump in price. But if you look at what it would be if it was adjusted to match salaries, how much salaries have gone up, which means we would multiply it by 10, well, then that Colt Python would be $1,840. The Smith & Wesson would be $950. And the Ruger would be $900. So if they kept up with inflation, they'd be cheaper compared to the average salary now. And now, just for shits and giggles, let's see how much they would be if they kept up with the same rate of inflation that the cost of cars has seen since then. Well, the Colt Python, if it went up as much as cars went up, would be $3,256. The Smith would be $1,681. And the Ruger would be $1,593. That's quite a bit more than inflation or keeping up with salaries. And if you look at what they would cost if they went up as much as housing has gone up, well, then the Colt would be $5,961. The Smith & Wesson would be $3,078. And the Ruger would be $2,913. That's quite an increase. Thank God they haven't gone up like that, or nobody would be able to afford guns, because that is crazy. And that shows you why a lot of people can't afford houses nowadays. When you compare what they used to cost compared to the average salary, compared to what they cost now compared to the average salary, they have skyrocketed. So now that we've looked at all these numbers, let's look at what the actual MSRP of these three guns is now in the modern market and compare it to all those other numbers. What the MSRP was back then, what it would be if it went up with inflation, what it would be if it went up with salaries, etc. Well, the Colt now has an MSRP of $1,499. The Smith & Wesson, a Model 36, the Classic Series one now, has an MSRP of $859, and that's one of their more expensive guns. And the Ruger Blackhawk now is $879. So as you can see, even though they've gone up in price, they haven't really kept up with inflation except for the Ruger. The Ruger is the only one that is slightly more expensive than it would be if it had kept up with inflation. The other two are less than. And the Colt is more less than the Smith. It has done a worse job of keeping up with inflation. As compared to its previous price, it's less expensive now, even more so than the Smith. If you look at these prices adjusted for salary, well, none of them are as much as they would be now if they were adjusted for salary. They're all cheaper. As far as being compared to the average income now, guns are more affordable than they were in 1970. And remember, 1970 is back when I was just a little Yankee. I hadn't even started kindergarten yet. So that's a long time ago. In fact, if you look at these guns and what they make up as a percentage of income, in 1970, that Colt Python would have been 3% of the average household income. The Smith & Wesson would have been 1.5% of the average household income. And the Ruger would have also been about 1.5% of the average household income. They're close enough in price, they really don't make much of a difference there. And if you look at what their percentage of the average income is now, the Colt has dropped to 2.4. That's a drop of like 0.6%. The Smith has dropped to 1.4. That's 0.1% drop. Now the Ruger has remained about the same. So if you look at these three guns, the Ruger has almost kept up with prices, but it hasn't gotten more expensive, and the other two have gotten less expensive. They cost less than they would if they'd kept up with inflation, if they would have kept up with salaries, if they would have kept up with other items that have gone up. They'd be more expensive than they are now. They're actually cheaper now. Now, this is where a lot of people will say, well, you're not looking at the right kind of guns. If you looked at cheap guns, that's what really made guns affordable back then, because you could get guns that were really cheap, like a Raven or something like that, one of the little Saturday night specials. And you could usually get those for about $39. If you looked at the MSRP on one of those in 1970, it was $39. And let's see how that breaks down using the same figures here. Adjusted to inflation, that same Raven would be $363 now. Adjusted to salary, it would be $390. Equal to a car would be $690. If it went up as much as houses did, it would be $1,263. And it would have been 0.6% of the average household income. Now, can you get Ravens now? Not really. But can you get guns for $390? You can get some guns for less than that, like $299. Some SARS and other manufacturers that make fairly decent guns, but they're less than that. And if you want a really good gun for like $400, just a hair over, you can get a Beretta APX A1. A far better gun than a Raven could have ever hoped to be, and it's basically the same percentage of the annual salary. It's 0.7% instead of 0.6%. So you can still afford a cheap gun, but now that cheap gun you're buying isn't going to blow up in your hand. It's actually a quality gun. So even when you look at things like Ravens and the cheap alternatives you can get back in the day, we still have those today, and we have more availability of them, and they're better guns. So that's a good thing. And some people will say, well, yeah, but if you went back even further, or if you just looked at the average cost of guns, if you averaged everything together, And that took a lot of research on my part to do that, but I did do it. And here's what the average gun cost was back in 1970. It was about $92. Adjusted for inflation, that's $857. Adjusted in relation to salary, that would make it $920, equal to a car, $1,628, equal to a house, $2,980. And right now, the average gun cost is about $700. So the average gun cost is actually less now than it was in 1970. Considerably less. In fact, back then the average cost of a gun was 1.5% of the annual income. Now it's 1.2% of the annual income for the average. And as far as going back to the 20s and the 30s, it stays pretty much the same. You don't really see much of a change in this formula. So even though nowadays we're paying more for everything, and some people do love to complain about how expensive guns have gotten, they really haven't gotten more expensive. People are just looking at history through rose-colored glasses. They're believing nostalgia that isn't true because they like the idea of it being true, regardless of whether it is or it isn't. Because when it comes to guns today, it's kind of a golden age. Not only are we getting back a lot of our rights that we never really ever enjoyed before, back in the 70s and the 80s, but we have more guns available now than ever before, and they're even at better prices than they used to be. So as far as buying a gun goes nowadays, even though we got some hoops to jump through that we still got to get rid of, like I said, this is a golden age, not only when it comes to availability, but also when it comes to pricing.